Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Trends and Tensions in Environmental Philanthropy. I'm Caitlin Torgerson, a Senior Vice President with CCS Fundraising, coming to you from Seattle today. Thanks for being with us. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We do ask that you remain on mute today to give our speakers the floor. We're also happy to be sharing a recording of the presentation afterward, so know that you can come back to it and share it. It is my pleasure to thank our panelists today for joining us. We'll be doing introductions and you'll be hearing from them in just a few moments. Our topic today is trends and tensions in environmental philanthropy, and it has three parts. First, I'm going to share a very brief overview of philanthropy today, and especially some of the trends that we've been seeing in the environmental sector. Then we're going to have a moderated panel discussion where we'll dive deep into those trends, but also the tensions, the opportunities, the challenges that these trends are driving. And finally, we will have time for your questions toward the end of the session. Please share any questions that you have for our panelists through the chat box at any time. We'll be collecting those and asking them of our panelists toward the end of this session. Without further ado, let's begin. Though we don't know for sure and won't know until there's more data released in the next couple months here, it appears that philanthropy was far more resilient in 2020 than I think most of us would have anticipated. Certainly more resilient than I anticipated if you'd asked me last March. That said, like the rest of the economy and society, the pandemic affected the nonprofit sector and philanthropy unevenly, to say the least. Now, some nonprofit sectors were hit particularly hard, right? Arts and culture is a clear example. They had an especially difficult year. While other sectors appear to have had dramatically increased fundraising results. Social and human services, for example, reported extraordinary growth in response to those outside needs of our communities through this time. Now, what we're hearing from our friends at environmental organizations, large and small, is that they seem to be falling somewhere in between. Donors seem to be treating it like a stable, sort of evergreen sector in philanthropy, one that continues to receive steady support even through these economic downturns. If this is the case, this is really encouraging news, given the clear urgency of funding your work. It's also not surprising to those of us who have been paying attention to the growth in this sector over time. This slide has a caveat. It groups together a pretty broad continuum of nonprofits, but we do think it's the best long-term trending data that we have relating to environmental philanthropy. So giving to the environment and animal welfare organizations has grown dramatically in the last 30 years. The consistent growth is encouraging, and the curve going into 2020 was quite steep. That said, the sector has remained a really small portion of overall philanthropy at just 3% of total giving in 2019. We all know that there is room for growth and an urgency for growth. In this next slide here, we drill down into some of the mixed experiences that nonprofits had in 2020. The data on the left comes from CCS's Philanthropic Climate Survey this January. It shows that roughly half of organizations are reporting a decline in fundraising over the past year, while the other half have been neutral and even seen an increase in fundraising outcomes. We've also seen over time in the pandemic that has been improving steadily, that more organizations are continuing to report increased or neutral fundraising outcomes, and fewer are reporting declines. One other piece of data here, you see on the right that a recent study from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project indicated a 10.6% growth in overall giving from 2019 to 2020. That these are early findings, and if they hold, this is really encouraging about what philanthropy is in our sectors. We're going to know more, of course, when the Giving USA data is released in June, but this is a very positive piece of information. Now, while the pandemic has really deeply affected philanthropy, it was by no means the only backdrop in the past year. Social unrest and urgent calls for racial equity and justice propelled some donors and nonprofits to respond, and some of them in big ways. What you see here on the left is how donors responded to this movement. We know that at least $11.5 billion was given in support of the movement in 2020. We hope it was more than that, and we hope to see it continue. There is some, clearly, that's continued to some degree, but we hope to see it continue at the same rate and pace as it did last year. On the right, you see how some nonprofits responded. This again comes from CCS's survey in January of this year. It shows that about half of respondents reported some type of change in their fundraising or board practices in response to the racial equity movement. We would like to see that higher. A final piece of data on the next slide here. Charitable giving continues to be concentrated from high net worth and ultra high net worth households. You see here on the right that 45% of giving in 2019 came from just 1% of households. Well, we don't have new data yet. We know anecdotally that some really huge gifts were made in the last year, that this concentration of wealth has resulted in a few philanthropists with really extraordinary influence on our sector. I won't say more now, but the panelists will be addressing some of the implications and the tensions of this conversation in a moment here. So speaking of our panelists, I'd like to wrap up this part of the conversation with a quick snapshot of the trends that our panelists are going to address, or some of the trends that they're going to be addressing. So at a really high level, here's some of what we're seeing. We're seeing more resources flowing to the sector, more organizations joining the movement for racial justice and equity, big giving from wealthy households. And we're also seeing growing attention to the funding needs of grassroots organizations, which, as we all know, have long played a really crucial role in advancing environmental initiatives. I will leave it to our panel to dig into the trends and especially to discuss some of the tensions and opportunities and challenges that come with them. So with that, I would like to pass the mic to my colleague, Marco Santiago, a vice president at CCS, who's going to be introducing our panelists and moderating the panel today. Marcos?
Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to everyone for joining, especially to our panelists for taking the time to share your expertise, your leadership, and your just your overall commitment to the sector with us today. So I'm going to take a few moments just to briefly introduce each of our panelists one at a time and pose the first question to each of them to get their unique perspective on that question. I'm just going to go in alphabetical order by first name. So I want to start first with Gladys Limon. So Gladys is the executive director of the California Environmental Justice Alliance, also known as CEJA. It's a California statewide community-led alliance that works to achieve environmental justice by advancing policy solutions. She joined CEJA in 2017 as its very first executive director. Gladys has more than 18 years of experience in legal, policy, and community-based work for environmental justice and civil rights. Her work has ranged from protecting immigrants' rights as a litigator at Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund to challenging fossil fuel and other toxic operations as a senior attorney at Communities for a Better Environment. Her legal work includes an unprecedented environmental and civil rights lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles, challenging the rubber stamping of oil drilling projects in communities of color. And in leading CEJA, Gladys is advancing a just transition in California through climate justice, energy equity, and green zones policy and programmatic work. She was born and raised in Oxnard, California, earned a BA in Chicano Studies and Sociology from UC Santa Barbara, and received her JD from Stanford Law School. So Gladys, I'd like to turn it over to you first. Please feel free to take a minute or two to give some additional information to our attendees around context just that you were doing and the work of CEJA in this space. And then specifically would love to just have you start to answer this first question, which is, from your unique role and perspective, what is one positive trend that you are seeing and one potentially challenging or negative trend that you're seeing as it relates to philanthropy in the environmental space?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate that introduction, Marcos. As you said, CEJA is an alliance of 10 leading environmental justice organizations in California that come together as an alliance to unite their local, regional, and statewide environmental justice work to build together, to develop and advance advance statewide solutions for systemic change. And these are organizations working in communities at the front line of pollution and the environmental health crisis and the climate crisis, and are working for a just transition. And this is critically important because solutions must be informed by and be responsive to people who are most impacted by the issues. Now, in response to your question, I'll start with a bit of context. Several years ago, the philanthropic community increased their interest and investment in DEI efforts, recognizing the concerning trend at mainstream environmental organizations regarding the lack of diversity and the homogeneous leadership. But this interest did not translate into or really connect to an interest in racial justice and equity. And there seemed to be like a conflating of the two, and they're not necessarily the same. And so we saw an investment in mainstream organizations for DEI purposes, rather than an investment in organizations that already have seasoned leadership of color and DEI as part of their very fabric in doing equity work and racial justice work. And so there was a negative impact because that shifted our dollars and partnerships to organizations who really don't need it the most, and shifted investments away from organizations with racial equity expertise, the organizations that have been doing it for many, many years. And there was also during that time from philanthropic funders exhibited a lack of deep understanding about environmental racism and movement work, a lack of understanding of environmental justice work, and also like a lack of comfort in exploring the issues. And that was frustrating. Now, a positive trend as a result of just horrific events over the last year and the rise of movement for Black lives, the brutal ways in which systemic racism is being overtly unleashed for all to behold. This is a sobering time in which then it's had the impact of different members in the field making meaningful shifts. There seems to be now a new understanding from philanthropic partners, and there is a renewed interest or just a new interest in supporting organizations that are environmental justice organizations that are steeped in racial equity work with leaders of color. So though there are now new investments and partnerships shifting to those organizations. A cautionary note here, and which I'll put under the negative trend, is that in this current moment in which we're seeing this very important, necessary shift, there are genuine efforts and intentions across the environmental community to reflect on their own role as to racial equity. So mainstream organizations and non-environmental justice organizations are making shifts, which is commendable. So organizations not steeped in racial justice and equity work are now speaking a lot about equity and justice, and they're integrating this framework and making some pivots. But this similarly threatens to shift investments away from environmental justice and equity organizations. There are existing long-standing organizations that do this work. They're the experts at it. It's what they've been doing for years. And I'm constantly amazed at the volume of work and significant shifts regularly being made by environmental justice organizations with skeletal staffs and skeletal budgets. And there are community-based organizations throughout the country that have important expertise, incredible skill sets, networks, and have built effective vehicles to create huge shifts. So there is some room to grow in shifting to fund movement work and power building work. And this includes funding environmental justice ecosystems. And so I can talk a little bit more about that a bit later in our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gladys. Just a really quick follow-on question for folks who are here that aren't necessarily as versed in the concepts of environmental justice. Can you just elaborate just briefly for us to help folks understand a bit more about the context and what that looks like in reality?
Yeah, so just to start with our organization and EJ organizations throughout the country, these are advocates and organizations that are working in and building power in communities that are at the forefront, that are at the fence line of polluting sources and at the root of the climate crisis of the fossil fuel infrastructure. So the work is based off of the lived experiences of these communities through an intersectional lens. And we know that pollution is not distributed equally. There is a deep history of systemic, structural pillars throughout our country, based on our economic system, and based on power structures that have have created systems such as like redlining, in which particular communities have been disinvested in, have not benefited from environmental investments, or technology, for example, at this point, and our communities that have instead borne the brunt of a fossil fuel-based economy and have for many years, for decades, have been suffering those impacts, have been impacted in ways of their health, of life expectancy, of lost days at work. And so these are communities that are the most burdened by polluting sources in the fossil fuel industry, but are least benefiting from the shifts in investment toward a renewable energy-based economy. And again, are the ones who have expertise because they see these operations on a daily basis. They understand how it's impacting people. And so environmental justice work is advocacy work that is based on empowering those communities and ensuring that proposed solutions are informed by that expertise, so that we are ensuring that these communities can thrive as we're making this shift.
Thank you so much. I put you on the spot there just to define that for everyone. And I appreciate you walking us through that, especially for folks that this is a very new or fairly new concept for. Let's move to Mike Brune. Michael Brune is the executive director of the Sierra Club, America's largest and most influential grassroots environmental organization. Mike has nearly 30 years of experience in environmental organizing and development. He began his environmental career as an organizer for Greenpeace and later joined Rainforest Action Network, where he ultimately served as the executive director for 7 years. Since joining the Sierra Club in 2010, Mike's work at the club has addressed the climate crisis through advocacy, advancing just climate solutions, and building a movement and membership base of nearly 3.8 million supporters. Mike grew up in New Jersey, graduated from West Chester University in Pennsylvania with degrees in economics and finance. So Mike, same question to you. If you are able to take a moment or two to share a little bit more context on the work that the Sierra Club is doing in this space, would love to hear about that. And then if you could answer that question, from your unique perspective and role, what is one positive trend that you're seeing, excuse me, as it relates to philanthropy in the environmental space, and what is one potentially challenging or negative trend that you're seeing in the space?
Sure. Thanks, Marcos. And hi, everybody. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join this conversation. As you heard, I'm Mike Brune, Executive Director for the Sierra Club. I use he, him, and his pronouns. And I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is the occupied territory of the Ohlone people. Sierra Club is focused intensely on climate change by working to dismantle the fossil fuel industry, to protect our forests and promote other natural-based solutions like regenerative agriculture, and to do so in a justice-centered way so that the people and the communities who have been most impacted from pollution are the ones getting the most immediate relief and who are benefiting from the economic transition that should be accelerating. I would say, what I would add to the conversation at this point is that as we work on climate change, we note that most coal plants across the country, and there are more than 200 of them still in operation, are located in low-income communities and communities of color. Most gas plants in the country, and there are more than 2,000 of them, are located in low-income communities and communities of color. Most pipelines, most LNG terminals, most oil refineries, most petrochemical manufacturing facilities, most compressor stations, most polluting facilities are often located in communities that have been devalued and are viewed sometimes as being expendable or seemingly so. And so there is no way in which we can be successful at fighting climate change without addressing the systemic root causes of the racism and the way in which people are devalued. And we have to approach this work with empathy and to acknowledge the very simple fact that in addition to living in communities in which the schools in these communities are less strong and less able to provide a quality education than whiter schools in more affluent areas, in which people living in these communities are often subject to more violence from law enforcement or who are not treated the same way by the judicial system. These are the same communities where it is difficult to breathe. More than half of the people in our country live in places where it is often unhealthy to breathe air. And these are most often communities of color, low-income communities. And we have tens of millions of people who lack regular access to safe drinking water. So all of our work has to be, as was said earlier by Gladys, has to be rooted in justice and centered in justice. We are a national environmental organization, traditionally white-led. We are one of those organizations that is undergoing a transformation that needs to both reckon with our pasts and be better prepared to be good allies in our work in the future. So that's the work in which, the work that we're doing right now, it's specifically to focus on fighting climate change, but to do so in a way that is informed by and responsive to the needs of the people in the communities in which we work. The trends that I would point to, I would say a positive trend would be that I do believe that there is more money moving into the space, into the climate space generally, and slowly, sometimes imperceptibly moving into organizations that are smaller, more community-based, more focused on power building, still delivering meaningful and measurable results, but also building power for the long term. And that's part of the negative trend as well, that even though there is a slow shift happening, it's not happening at the scale that is needed, it's not happening at the pace that is needed, and there are opportunities that are being missed by not more deeply investing in the kind of movement building and power building that will, in addition to specific campaign outcomes, set us up better for a more sustainable and just future.
Thank you so much, Mike. Last but not least, Sudha Nandagopal is the Chief Executive Officer of Social Venture Partners International, a global philanthropic network that cultivates effective philanthropists, strengthens nonprofits, and invests in collaborative solutions. Sudha is a nationally regarded organizer, facilitator, strategist, and movement builder focused on democratizing systems of power. She has led systems-changing initiatives for social, environmental, and racial justice across sectors, including government, nonprofits, and philanthropy. Through her work, she has built expertise in stakeholder engagement, collaborative problem-solving, and power building with communities of color, immigrants, and refugees. As CEO of SVP International since 2019, Sudha cultivates and expands a global philanthropic network of over 3,500 changemakers to catalyze more resources to communities, to share their power and wealth with communities, and to listen to and provide communities what they need most. Sudha grew up in Spokane, Washington, and graduated from Cornell with a bachelor's degree in environment and public policy. So same question to you. First, please do take a moment or two to share a bit more about SVPI. And then if you could answer the question around one particular positive trend and one potentially challenging trend that you're seeing in the space.
Thank you so much, Marcos, for that introduction, and great to join this panel of really awesome leaders. So really quickly about SVPI, we are a 20-year-old global network. We are the largest network of engaged philanthropists, and we have over 40 locations in 8 countries. So our viewpoint often goes beyond just the United States as we're thinking about what's happening in donor trends, although of course, the data that we get from the United States in terms of giving is significant and more significant than some of the other countries where philanthropy is an emerging area. Social Venture Partners International also last year, in the face of the moment that we found ourselves in, as well as a broader transition that we were hearing from donors, we launched Reimagine Giving, which is a platform that's really about centering the importance of collective giving, of donors being accountable, mutually accountable to each other, but especially to those that they are investing in, and also connected to their communities. We really believe that it is community leadership that should guide donor interests and donor behavior rather than the other way around. Now, that's a big cultural shift. So that's the work of SVP around the globe, is really bringing donors together to pool their funds in collective giving as a mechanism that actually helps to democratize wealth, because what it's allowing communities to do is have people put their money together and then make decisions in a collaborative about where that money needs to flow to. So I'm sort of the person sitting here without an official environmental organization behind me, but I just want to name also that most recently, before SVP, I was co-founded and led the City of Seattle's Equity and Environment Initiative. So I saw some big trends there as well related to environmental philanthropy, and I'm excited for that discussion. But today, just for this opening question, I'll start by sharing that last year around this time, our board at SVP had conversations with donors around the globe, really to say like what was happening and to check in and see how people were reacting to the pandemic. And one of the things that was really interesting from my perspective was how many of the donors really want mechanisms that allow them to multiply their impact and participate in collective giving, catalyze more resources to promising community-led solutions, and frankly, be able to be really part and parcel with communities. And that's true because a lot of our donors are folks who are local. They see, particularly when it comes to issues like the racial justice uprisings, this is impacting their friends and neighbors, or it's impacting their families directly, right? So there was really a concern that the distancing that has happened over the years in the philanthropic sector between who is a donor and who is the community member was something that people felt compelled and wanted to break down. And I think we started to see that in some of the trends that emerged last year, which I'm excited about, related to the significant growth in pooled giving and pooled funds, as well as the growth in people participating in mutual aid and kind of other alternative forms of moving resources into communities. On the side of the challenge, from my view, I think both looking at this from the environmental perspective, but also just broadly in the donor sector, one of the things that I've noticed is this increasing focus on big donors, and frankly, to the detriment of the fact that there are a lot of people in communities who are eager to be part of their organizations, part of movements, who may not be writing large checks, but when pooled together have significant economic power. And that feels to me like something that we often miss in our search for kind of the big ticket donor. And what that also seems to do is create this sense of competition between organizations, where I think increasingly I'm hopeful that we can take a view that there is no scarcity of resources for the challenges ahead. And increasingly, if we can figure out ways that donors are putting their work together so that they are collaborating and pooling funds and making it easier for then organizations to partner together to receive those funds, that we can really take more of a movement approach to our fundraising and to our philanthropy rather than an organization by organization approach. And I know we'll get into that as how that relates to the environmental work specifically, but I've seen real evidence of how that can work here in the city of Seattle, where we have environmental organizations who partner and collaborate in that way, and it has really led to a more powerful grassroots environmental movement. So with that, I'll hand it back.
Thank you so much. We'll move through a few questions here. I just wanted to note for those that are attending, if you do want to drop questions into the chat, some of our folks from CCS are going to be looking at those questions and teeing them up into a separate space for us to visit toward the end of this conversation. So hopefully we'll get to a few of the audience questions at the very end of of our time together today. So please don't be shy about dropping some questions in there. So let's actually stay on the topic that you raised. And I'd love to just pass this around to the full group here. You brought this up, this concept of mega donors and the pursuit of mega donors as the answer to a lot of the issues. So as we know, and probably most folks on this call know, toward the end of 2020, Jeff Bezos announced and distributed nearly $800 million from his One Earth Fund, saying that it was the beginning of a larger $10 billion investment in the environmental sector that the One Earth Fund would make over the coming decade. So among the recipients of that $800 million, 5 large, traditionally big green organizations received the bulk of the funding. So Nature Conservancy, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, World Resources Institute, and World Wildlife Fund each received about $100 million. There were several smaller organizations that received funding, including NDN Collective, which is an indigenous-led organization dedicated to building indigenous power while fostering a world that is built on the foundation of justice and equity for all people and for the planet. They received $12 million. The Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice, they received $43 million. There was a lot of pushback on Bezos' original announcement, in which grassroots and justice groups were slated to receive even smaller grants, especially compared to some of the very large recipient organizations. Some of those organizations that received large amounts of funding received a lot of pushback as well, both from internal within their organizations, as well as just generally in the conversation for out in the world. So question to each of you, and let's maybe go in reverse order. So those starting with you, and you started to touch on this. So how do you view the billionaire mega funders like Jeff Bezos? Do they have a role? Can they have a role? As they're investing, what would you hope to have them consider? And maybe it's just the wrong approach. I mean, you started to speak about some alternatives to that. So we'd love to get your take on this question.
Thanks for that question. I think that this is, the big donors, like I said, I think take a lot of our attention and a lot of our concern. I will lift up that the Solutions Project, which is led by a woman of color, was also one of the recipients of the Earth Fund. And I think what an organization to watch in terms of how they do their work. They've been centering communities of color for many, many years now, and are, I think, really one of the exemplary organizations of a funding organization that was willing to look at themselves and change how they showed up. So, what my feeling is, like, there's kind of the meta level piece of this, which I think about, which is, was that an approach that actually allowed for democratizing wealth, right? What's happened in the United States, and we could get into a much deeper conversation about this, but I think some of the pillars of racial justice have to do with the fact that we have stripped out some tenets of democracy from how we are managing wealth. So while on one hand, generosity is something we want to value and encourage, on the other hand, I think I'm left with a little bit of the question of, then, are we all just beholden to these wealthy people feeling generous towards our particular issues, when what we really need is deep investment in communities of color to substantially turn the tide and change systems, right? At the end of the day, government is still underfunded in many of the communities where this work needs to happen. And so as long as that remains the case, it's going to be hard to make the level of impact that we need. And so I sort of see it as kind of a two-pronged approach. Like, yes, we need to have that wealth move quickly out into communities. It really does need to move faster to the grassroots and to the people of color-led work, in my view, because we're not only trying to sort of even the playing field right now between the revenue of the large organizations and the smaller organizations, we're also trying to make up for years and years of underinvestment in those communities. And my concern is that often we aren't thinking about that sort of equity should not mean sameness. Equity has to mean that the solutions fit the moment and the communities who need it most. And so that would mean to me, like, those gifts should be reversed, right? With the mega dollars going to the grassroots organizations, the women of color led organizations, to make up for the huge disparities in funding and how philanthropic dollars have flowed over the years. So I'll leave it to the rest of the panelists to get in there, but I'll start with that.
Thank you, Mike. I'll throw it over to you as the executive director of our 170 million plus or minus organization. How do you respond to Sudha? How do you view the mega donors and the roles that they play in funding the work across the sector?
Sure. I guess I have similar thoughts. I'd use different words, but I have similar thoughts to what Sudha is saying. I guess I would put it as a both and approach, right? So taking Bezos specifically, I have some concerns about the social environmental impacts of the company that has generated that wealth, but setting that aside, I appreciate his generosity. And I think that in the first round of funding, that's a significant amount of resources going to, as you cited, a range of groups doing really good work. NDN Collective, Solutions Project, Hive, some of the international stuff, and the big organizations. They're going to do some really good work with those funds. And so I'm glad that Bezos is deciding to be so generous. I do think that there was a missed opportunity and that the grant, I wouldn't have allocated those grants in that way. But I want to underscore that that is a lot of money moving into a space generally that needs it pretty desperately. And my hope is that as the foundation gets staffed up and they have more resources to evaluate the field, that there will be shifts made in the second and third and fourth rounds of funding. But I think what I would add to that is what I think Sudha was also talking to is I think for any institution, for any organization like our own or other organizations, the extent to which we focus on one donor or even a small handful of really big donors, it's not sustainable, it's not healthy, and it can lead to a significant imbalance. And so, you know, at the Sierra Club, we have really tried to both diversify our fundraising, not become dependent on any one donor. And I would say generally, the kind of collaborative grant making, as well as collaborative work that needs to happen is where I think most of the growth is going to come from and most of the impact is going to come from. So for some specific examples that I would cite, there's the Equitable and Just Climate Platform, which is about a $6 million budget over the next 2 years, collection of organizations, a couple hundred EJ organizations, as well as maybe a dozen or so national environmental organizations where we've been doing collaborative fundraising, all of the money going to the EJ organizations. There's Building Equity and Alignment, which is collaborative fund making that has brought in a fair amount of money, insufficient but significant amount of money, similarly that is coming in to organizations and then being granted out to EJ groups. There's also the Mosaic, which is another collaborative fundraising and collaborative grant making process, which will devote, I think, about $20 million over the next 3 years, 90 to 95% of it going to the grassroots. Sierra Club is on the steering committee or the equivalent for all three, doesn't get funds from any of the three, but we see that as integral to our work to help to make sure that our partners who are doing really important work on the ground have the resources and the capacities that they need in order to be effective. So those are examples of what I would cite, not to push Bezos or any one donor down, but just to be clear that a singular focus chasing after that shiny new object is not going to set up the movement for the work that we need to do in the years ahead.
Thank you, Mike. Gladys, last but not least.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I agree with a lot of what was said. You know, a massive injection of money like the one made by Bezos is such a powerful sword, undeniably. And it can work in favor of or against the transformative solutions and shifts that we so desperately need. You know, and I think what was mentioned about, you know, the source of these funds is really important to raise, particularly to be aware of, or for the organizations that receive this mass investment to be aware of, you know, that the business model used by Bezos is creating, replicating, and exacerbating racial injustice, right, from workers' rights to environmental racism. And also the infrastructure of the goods movement and our new online shopping culture are also disproportionately cited in low-income communities and communities of color. So there are terrible land uses and practices by Amazon, for example, from where they're citing warehouses to the transportation corridors in communities that are already suffering from cumulative impacts and breathe some of the most unhealthy air in the country. And so, you know, these mass investments, of course, build the capacity of the organizations receiving the funds, and it also adds weight to their approach and to their advocacy, to their policy solutions that are advanced, you know, by those large organizations. And it's a really powerful signal to decision makers regarding the agenda as well. So it exacerbates the equity gap in important ways, and in this case, it's doing that. So it behooves those large organizations to make pledges and commitments, you know, about their own practices and advocacy as they impact communities of color, and to shift funds, you know, frankly, to racial justice and environmental justice organizations.
Thank you, Gladys. A quick question that is relevant to your work and to what you're referencing that's coming in from the audience, I just want to throw in quickly here, is how can a community-based organization join a platform or become a part of a collaborative effort? I'm curious if you can speak to that.
Well, yeah, I'm not quite understanding the question. You know, there are various types of collaborative efforts, coalitions, alliances throughout the country. So I'm not sure I'm understanding what is motivating the question, but I can speak to, you know, in California, there are various coalitions. I'm aware of some across the country, and I would just encourage those organizations to reach out and be proactive in expressing interest in those collaborative efforts.
Great, thank you. Just turn for a moment to specifically the racial equity conversation and the environmental justice conversation that we've been starting to have. You all have referenced this to some degree, right? One of the positive outcomes around the many challenges that we've experienced over the course of the past year or so has been a renewed focus on the gross disparities in resources between high-income and low-income communities, the ongoing injustices faced by many communities of color, and the plainness with which existing systems and structures really reinforce those disparities. The conversations around racial equity, environmental justice have become more mainstream. Even looking at the Biden-Harris administration, the first 2 months of that administration, there has been a host of proposals, policy proposals, executive orders that put more attention on these issues and are trying to address some of the harms that have been done by historical energy labor and other policies that are in place. So there's a recent executive order, for instance, that established a government-wide Justice 40 initiative. For those of you that have not heard about this, this is an initiative that has the goal of delivering 40% of the overall benefits of relevant federal investments to disadvantaged communities specifically, and then tracking performance toward that goal through the establishment of an environmental justice scorecard. So at the federal level, a very specific focus on environmental justice, on racial equity. I would love to just ask, and maybe starting with you, Mike, you referenced earlier the Sierra Club as a traditionally predominantly white-run organization, that many of the members and folks that have been involved historically are white. How have these conversations around race equity and around environmental justice impacted the philanthropy that you are receiving at the Sierra Club? How are donors responding? How is that conversation with donors changing, if at all?
Okay, I'll be quick because I'm also very interested, like I think a lot of others are, in Sudha and Gladys's thoughts on this as well. So what I would say for Sierra Club, first internally, the representation of senior level managers, executive level managers has shifted pretty significantly. We now have a majority people of color running departments, as well as doing executive level management in the organization. Internally, we are working to change almost everything that we do, from how we hire people to how we onboard people, the leadership development track that we have for people coming up through the organization, assuming more responsibility, as well as developing the competencies, the skills that are required of managers, specifically for racial justice, and more generally, managing across difference, having an ability to intervene, to interrupt toxic behavior, making sure that where there is a will to be more equitable, there's also the skill to actually implement our values, not just talk about our values. When it comes to our philanthropy and our communications with donors, I would say it's all over the place. We have some donors that are really pushing us to be specific and strategic, to be as strategic in our own internal equity work or the external equity aspects, the impact that we're having externally, as strategic as that as we are fighting a pipeline or a gas plant or wherever it might be. And then we have other donors who are asking, what does racism have to do with the environment? And so we with our volunteers, or with our staff and with our donors, the conversation across society, the conversation obviously is pretty broad, and the audiences are pretty varied. I guess the only thing that I would like to add is I think this week is a great illustration of the challenges our movement faces, right? We have a trial for Derek Chauvin, where we are reliving a horrific murder that happened a little bit less than a year ago. Many of us have seen the video of that poor woman who was brutally beaten in New York City, while law enforcement officers, security officers stood by and watched. All of these horrific things are happening at the same time that we are seeing some significant action that is really positive coming from the administration today. A series of proposed investments that are long overdue, desperately needed, that hint at the potential to start to catch up to years and years and years of injustice. And so my hope is that each of us, individually, institutionally, can do the work that's needed to become more just and equitable, that philanthropy invests in the leaders and the institutions that have been and continue to lead and to do this work effectively, and that we can be mindful and empathetic of the challenges that we're facing on an hourly basis, but do our work effectively to take advantage of the opportunities that are here right now.
Thanks, Mike. Sudha, you referenced democratizing philanthropy, decolonizing it to some degree. Specifically, as you're trying to bring together donors or communities to fund different work, whether it's in the environmental space or other, how are folks responding to these issues of environmental justice and racial equity? How is that potentially changing the way that you're going about bringing people together, where you're directing dollars? Can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something I want to state just at the outset here, which is that wealth in the United States and around the globe is primarily held by white people, white men, right? So there is a body of work, I think, for those of us who have networks made up of those folks, organizations like the Sierra Club, to really be thinking about how are we moving those folks on this work of racial equity and moving them urgently to change how they're showing up as funders and as donors to this sector and as systems change advocates. Because if we can, really take advantage of the power that exists within people who have benefited from this economic system to actually be the ones who help and follow the lead of communities of color and those who have been pushing on the system to change, I think we have a much more powerful movement and body of work ahead. So that's one thing I just want to name, which is that there is work here, and it's important work. But it's, to me, one of the things in the donor sector that's been really fascinating is, well, for the last several years, we've had Edgar Villanueva, Anand Giridharadas, there's lots of folks who have been talking about how broken the system of philanthropy is. But a lot of that focus has been on those mega donors, and it has been on the foundation sector. And when we were talking to our donors last year around the globe, what I was really surprised to find is that most of them are not actually, really in the weeds on those kind of trends. And so it was a whole new conversation for us. And we actually worked over the course of the fall to have several conversations in groups with donors where we talked about, how has philanthropy been broken? Where has money been going? Where could money be going? And how communities of color and people of color-led work often is the last to get investment. And so as a result of those conversations, we had donors who were stepping up and saying, gosh, I want to be part of the solution on this. I want to be putting money on the table in a collective pooled giving approach that allows people of color then to decide where that money needs to go. And so that's the kind of experiments that we're seeing happen across our network, where increasingly we had donors basically coming to us and saying, we need to put together a racial equity-based fund, really focus our funding on communities of color. We need to be looking at the opportunities that we have as people who live in these communities to actually expand the overall pool of giving, not just look at it as kind of a competitive issue. And so I think, to me, I was really heartened by the sense of urgency that I heard from donors, that they wanted to move in this direction. I think the other things to lift up here are the number of donors who are asking for and wanting to shift towards advocacy. I think is a real opening, and one that we should seize in any way we can, because advocacy has been underfunded, especially like the C4 and PAC dollars that need to happen to keep the pressure on our political system. So those are some of the things that I'm looking at, and I'm seeing that there is this emerging excitement from donors. And then on the other side, that we have donors of color who have gained wealth over the last number of years, who are also wanting to step into this moment and say, we want to be part of building the institutions and the movements that are going to support and protect our communities. And so I name all that because I think when we think about democratizing power, it's ultimately, the goal here is for us to have those multiracial, multi-sector communities where so many of us live otherwise in very segregated cities. Seattle's no exception to that rule. And so how can we actually make our movements and the way we fund our movements more reflective of the world that we're actually seeking to build? And that to me means we have to start getting people out of just wearing one hat of being a donor and another person of being the nonprofit recipient who has to be grateful and kind of figure out how to get another ask in front of that donor, to really more of a conversation about what do our communities need and how are we getting the resources to them. And I think if we can kind of break through to that, that's the opportunity I see in sort of the organizations like Social Venture Partners, where we are able to have some of those conversations outside of the traditional kind of one-on-one fundraising model that has emerged over the last many years of the nonprofit sector.
Thank you. Just looking at time, I just want to make sure we're wrapping up here pretty soon, but I want to turn it over to you, Gladys, for a moment, just to either respond directly to that question around how the race equity conversation is playing out for you and for Seha, or if you'd like to speak more broadly to some of the comments that Sudha just shared around just how we should be moving as a movement, how organizations are coming together as a movement, or other specific steps that you might recommend for us to think about more holistically, as opposed to individual donor by donor or organization by organization.
Yeah, thanks, Marcos. We cannot overcome the climate crisis without looking very closely at the roots of the crisis before us, how we got here. And we got here based on decades of industry and government neglect and really devaluing and disregarding the lives of people and of communities that are raising their children within dangerous proximities to fossil fuel operations and other polluting sources. Environmental racism really lies at the root of the crisis. In communities, again, for decades have fought against polluting fossil fuel operations, have tried to mitigate impacts, have opposed expansion, their harmful business model, and the problems have largely been disregarded and ignored. Everything from nuisances like noise to putrid smells, that impact well-being, to air pollution, water pollution, to limited green space. And the disregard, and the failure to address those issues have now grown to impact all of humanity. It's now a global crisis, and we know that even then, those that are first and worst hit by the climate crisis are Black, Indigenous, and communities of color across the world and domestically. And even then, their advocacy and proposed climate policy solutions continue to be largely disregarded. And so we're talking about real deep systemic problems, about corporate dominance over democracy, of racism, of extractive capitalism. So just like, this is a mass systemic human rights issue and of justice. And so it requires a systemic shift. And that can only happen through a movement. It really takes a movement, right? Movements toward systemic shifts must be led by those that are most impacted. We must be defining the issues and leading on the solutions. So our collective work must be centered on racial justice and equity. And, this approach and the framing is a shift for many philanthropic partners. The philanthropic community has a critically important role in partnering with movement organizations and advocates and resourcing that movement. And also for our advocacy allies, our non-EJ allies, to, partner in a way that, again, aligns with being equity and justice center. And movement work is challenging, but it's incredibly powerful. It's the only way that our country and the world has seen systemic shifts. And it's also more expensive upfront, but the long-term gain is greater. We multiply the impacts and we deepen and scale, the solutions. So we need to resource community-based organizations that are base building, that are building power, that are organizing, that are doing communications work, popular education. And this also involves different metrics, for philanthropic partners. But it's critically important in terms of, increasing capacity and sustainability to carry out this work in a movement framework. And, also being able to be comfortable with different metrics, fund infrastructure and organizational development, and also bring on additional organizations onto dockets. Right? It's really important to fund environmental justice ecosystems. And I'll raise one important example. The Libra Foundation has a commendable approach of funding an environmental justice ecosystem, of trusting their grantees and having streamlined processes, including on reporting, to allow maximum capacity to focus on actually doing the work. So with that, I know we're out of time, but I can't overstate how important this moment is, and it's just a culminating point in which we're at a pivoting stage. So we need to deepen the investment and partnership to ensure that we're indeed going to be able to turn the tide and make those transformative shifts to ensure a sustainable future in which all communities can thrive, particularly those communities that have borne the brunt of the fossil fuel-based economy.
Thank you so much, Gladys. Sudha, Mike, thank you to all the panelists for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. Thank you to the attendees who were here and joined us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of the questions. Some of them have been answered in the chat. We can try to follow up with folks specifically if we're able to. Reminder that this recording will be available to everyone who's registered. So there will be a link that's sent out to everyone who is registered for the event of this recording later. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it and hope you all have a wonderful day.